The soft afternoon sunlight bathed the cobblestone streets of the new urban neighborhood. It was a place that exuded tranquility and luxury, where large houses with meticulously maintained gardens were separated only by low fences, as white as snow. The tall, ancient trees cast long shadows over the pristine sidewalks, while the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed to be the only sound in an environment that felt almost timeless. Not subscribed yet? Join our community by clicking on subscribe and activate the bell icon to get notified every time there's a new video. Jonathan Carter stopped in front of his new house, a small smile playing on his lips. At 45 years old, with short hair and piercing eyes, he studied the white facade with dark brick accents. It was a modest home compared to the rest of the neighborhood, but it was perfect for what he was looking for: peace. A word that had been a luxury in his life as the head of an FBI investigative team, a job that demanded precision, composure under pressure, and constant personal sacrifices. For decades, he had worked tirelessly, solving complex cases and facing dangers that most wouldn't dare to imagine. But at this moment, standing in front of that house with its white fence and freshly cut lawn, Jonathan felt for the first time that he might be close to something he had been searching for all these years, a place he could finally call home. With a cup of coffee in hand, he sat on the wooden bench in his front yard. The bitter yet comforting aroma of coffee mixed with the fresh evening air. From there, he could see the nearby park, where children played while their parents chatted under the shade of the trees. He sighed with satisfaction. He had made the right choice. However, that moment of calm was soon interrupted. The roar of an engine shattered the silence like a stone breaking the surface of a still lake. A patrol car, white with dark blue accents, slowly pulled up in front of the house next door. Jonathan barely glanced at it. It was an ordinary detail, something common in any neighborhood. But what happened next completely changed his first impression of his new home. A man, white, in his early 40s, stepped out of the vehicle wearing a police uniform that seemed a little too tight on his stocky frame. But it was his expression that caught Jonathan's attention. It was neither friendly nor neutral, but rather a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something that soon became clear. As the officer reached into the car to grab something, Jonathan nodded at him in greeting. It was a polite, almost automatic gesture, but the officer didn't return the gesture. Instead, he stood still, staring at him. A few seconds later, he walked directly onto Jonathan's lawn with firm, almost confrontational steps. "What are you doing here?" the man asked, his rough voice carrying more than just curiosity. Jonathan looked up, surprised by the tone. Still, he remained calm, as he always did in tense situations. "Hello?" he responded, rising from the bench, with a polite smile. "I just moved in. This is my new home." The officer raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms over his chest. His eyes scanned Jonathan from head to toe, as if trying to decipher something that, to him, didn't quite fit. "Your house?" he repeated with evident disbelief. "You mean you bought this house?" Jonathan held the man's gaze, refusing to look away. He knew exactly what kind of insinuation lay behind that question, but he refused to respond with hostility. "That's right. I moved in yesterday," he said calmly, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Jonathan Carter." The officer ignored the gesture. Instead, he kept his arms crossed and took a step forward, invading Jonathan's personal space in a way that was anything but accidental. "Look," the man began, in a tone that tried to sound casual but was laced with condescension. "I've been living here for 8 years. This is a quiet neighborhood, and to be honest, I don't think this is the right place for you." Jonathan felt a wave of discomfort run through him. He had heard comments like this before, though rarely so direct. However, he didn't let his expression betray his emotions. That's interesting, Jonathan responded, his tone still calm but now carrying an undertone of firmness. I believe I have every right to decide where I live, as long as I follow the rules, but thank you for your advice. The officer frowned, clearly irritated by Jonathan's response. I'm just saying, this neighborhood has certain standards. Maybe another place would suit you better. Jonathan clenched his teeth slightly, maintaining his composure. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Look, he said, his voice firmer now, I don't know what your problem is with me, but I'm here to live, not to ask for permission from anyone. If you have nothing else to say, I think we can end this conversation right here. The officer stared at him, his lips pressed into a tight line. Finally he smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. I'm just giving you a warning, he said, before turning and walking toward his house. Don't make things complicated. We don't want unnecessary trouble around here. Jonathan watched him walk away, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. He had faced tense situations before, but this was different. This wasn't happening at work, this was happening in his home. That night, as he reviewed the security footage from the cameras he had installed, Jonathan muttered to himself with a hint of sarcasm, Welcome to the neighborhood, Jonathan. He knew that the road to the peace he had dreamed of would be anything but simple. The next morning, the neighborhood awoke with its usual serenity. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the branches of the trees as birds sang from their perches. Jonathan Carter had gone for an early morning run, a routine that always helped him clear his mind before facing the challenges of the day. The crisp air and the steady rhythm of his steps reassured him, reminding him that discipline was one of his greatest strengths. Click on subscribe and activate notifications. That way, you'll stay up to date with our upcoming videos and won't miss a thing. When he returned home, sweaty but refreshed, he prepared a light breakfast and sat in his front yard with a book in hand. The scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air, blending with the soft fragrance of the flowers lining the white fence. For a moment it seemed like everything was peaceful, but that peace was soon broken. Jonathan looked up as he noticed a familiar figure approaching along the sidewalk. It was Roy Anderson, the police officer from the previous day. Today, he wasn't wearing his uniform, but his attitude hadn't changed. Dressed in a tight-fitting t-shirt and faded jeans, he walked with his hands in his pockets, yet his posture still radiated the same intimidating authority he had displayed before. Roy stopped right in front of the fence, separating their properties, and though his lips formed something resembling a smile, his eyes remained cold. Jonathan Carter, right? He asked, in a tone that didn't require confirmation. Jonathan calmly closed his book, placing a bookmark between the pages, and nodded. Yes, we met yesterday, if I'm not mistaken. Roy rested an arm on the fence, leaning slightly forward. His smile widened, but it was still far from friendly. I think we need to talk, he said, his tone making it clear that it wasn't a suggestion. Jonathan looked at him calmly, his expression impassive, though his mind was already analyzing every word and movement the man made. Talk about what? Roy took a step closer to the fence, crossing his arms over his chest as if he were about to give an order. About you living here. Jonathan raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. He knew that confrontations like these required patience and a cool head. And what's so special about my decision to live here? He finally asked, his tone steady but carrying a barely perceptible edge. Roy let out a short laugh, as if the question was absurd. Come on, don't play dumb, he said, leaning in even further. This neighborhood is quiet. It has a certain standard, and I don't think it's the right place for someone like you. Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach, but his exterior remained unshaken. It wasn't the first time he had encountered such open prejudice, but each instance carried its own weight. "Roy," he began, his voice firmer now, "I bought this house with my own money. I follow the rules, I pay my taxes, and I have just as much right to live here as anyone else. If you have a problem with that, maybe you should keep it to yourself." Roy's smile disappeared completely, replaced by a tense, cold expression. "You know," he said, his tone now rougher, "I'm trying to help you. I just want you to understand that this isn't the place for you. There are other places that would be more suitable." Jonathan stood up, now matching the man's height. Across the fence, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Listen closely, Roy," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. "I don't need your help or your opinions on where I should or shouldn't live. This is my home, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment the two men stood face to face, separated only by the thin white fence. Roy clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. Finally he took a step back, though not without leaving one last warning. "Fine, but don't. Say I didn't warn you. I don't want trouble in this neighborhood." Jonathan watched him walk away, his heavy footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. Once again, the air felt thick with tension, as if something was on the verge of breaking. That afternoon, while Jonathan reviewed work documents on his computer, Roy's words kept replaying in his mind. He had faced dangerous criminals and life-or-death situations in his career, but this was different. This wasn't about a professional case. It was about his personal life, his home. He turned on the security cameras and reviewed the day's footage. Every one of Roy's movements had been recorded. Jonathan knew he would have to stay vigilant. This man wasn't just an unpleasant neighbor. He was a threat that couldn't be ignored. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky a deep red, Jonathan sat on the porch looking toward Roy's house. Something inside him told him that the real confrontation was yet to come. The evening light began to cast golden and reddish hues across the neighborhood. The shadows of the trees stretched long, covering the sidewalks as if the night were reclaiming its place. Jonathan, sitting on his porch, enjoyed the cool air of the evening while sipping a cup of tea. Though calm seemed to have returned to his surroundings, his mind remained alert. The morning's incident had left an unsettling echo in his thoughts. Roy Anderson wasn't just an unpleasant man. His attitude, his words, everything about him screamed danger. Over the years, Jonathan had learned to identify the signs of an impending threat, and Roy was a threat in every sense of the word. A noise in the street pulled him from his thoughts. He looked toward the sidewalk and saw Roy's figure staggering. His shirt was wrinkled, and something about his gait revealed that he wasn't completely sober. Jonathan frowned. It wasn't hard to guess that Roy was heading straight for him. "Still here?" Roy growled, stopping in front of the white fence dividing their properties. Jonathan carefully placed his teacup on the small table next to his chair and stood up, remaining calm. "Yes, Roy. Still here." Roy wobbled slightly, leaning against the fence as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. But his eyes, though glassy from alcohol, burned with anger. "I warned you," he said, his voice lower but no less aggressive. "This isn't a place for someone like you." Jonathan sighed. He had remained calm until now, but it was clear Roy had no intention of stopping. "Roy, you're crossing the line again. I've already made it clear that this is my home and I'm not leaving. If you have a problem with that, maybe you should seek help instead of insisting on something that isn't going to change." Those words seemed to ignite something in Roy. He straightened up abruptly, taking a step toward Jonathan's front yard. "Help?" he repeated, letting out a dry, mocking laugh. "You think I need help? I don't have a problem, Carter. You are. The problem?" Jonathan watched him carefully. There was something different about Roy's movements that night, something that told him the situation was about to turn dangerous. "Roy, I'm going to tell you one more time. This ends here. Go back to your house and stop creating problems." But Roy didn't listen. Instead, he reached for his waist and pulled out a gun. Jonathan barely had time to register the movement. before seeing the weapon pointed directly at him. "What are you going to do now, Carter?" Roy asked, his voice dripping with challenge and contained rage. "Call your FBI friends?" Jonathan slowly raised his hands, keeping his eyes locked on Roy. His voice remained calm, as if he were handling an armed suspect in one of his operations. "Roy, listen carefully. You're about to make a mistake that will ruin your life. Put that gun down right now." "Shut up!" Roy shouted, stepping closer to Jonathan. "Don't tell me what to do. This is my neighborhood, do you understand? My neighborhood." Jonathan noticed how Roy's hands trembled slightly, an indication of his emotional instability. Despite the danger, he maintained his firm stance. "You don't need to do this, Roy. Put the gun down and let's talk like adults. No one needs to get hurt." But Jonathan's words seemed to enrage Roy even more. "Don't talk to me like you're better than me," he shouted, his face red with anger and alcohol. "Who do you think you are, coming here and telling me how to live?" Jonathan, always analytical, decided to change his approach. Slowly, he moved one hand toward his pocket, pulling out his phone. Roy, noticing the movement, adjusted his grip on the gun. "What do you think you're doing?" he asked, his voice filled with suspicion. "I'm calling someone who can help you, Roy. I don't want this to end badly for either of us," Jonathan responded, calmly dialing a number. Roy frowned but didn't lower the gun. "Rick, this is Jonathan Carter," he said into the phone. "I need you to come to my house right now. We have a serious problem." 10 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car illuminated the street. Police Chief Rick Daniels stepped out of the vehicle, his face set in a grim expression. The moment he saw Roy pointing a gun at Jonathan, his expression shifted from disbelief to anger. "Roy!" Rick shouted, walking quickly toward them. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Roy turned to Rick, but didn't lower the gun. "Rick, it's not what it looks like. I'm just keeping order. This man—" Rick cut him off, his voice sharp. "Keeping order? By pointing a gun at an unarmed man in his own home? Do you realize what you've just done?" The tension in the air was suffocating. Jonathan remained silent, letting Rick take control of the situation. "Put that gun down right now, Roy," Rick ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Roy, finally realizing the gravity of his situation, lowered the weapon with trembling hands. Rick immediately snatched it from him and handed it to one of the officers who had just arrived. "You're suspended, Roy," Rick said, his gaze filled with pure disappointment. "What you've done isn't just unacceptable, it's criminal." Roy tried to protest, but Rick didn't give him the chance. "You're under arrest for making threats with a firearm and abusing your power." Jonathan watched as the officers handcuffed Roy and led him to the patrol car. His eyes were cold, but his posture remained calculated and composed. He knew this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Want more content like this? Then hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, because there's always fresh content here and you won't want to miss out. The next morning, the neighborhood, which had been a peaceful haven for years, was in shock. The events of the previous night had spread like wildfire. Within hours, neighbors peeked out their windows, whispering about what had happened. Some glanced curiously at Jonathan's house, while others avoided crossing the street in front of it, as if the place was now marked by a controversy they preferred to ignore. Jonathan, however, wasn't disturbed by the stares. He knew he had made the right decision by standing his ground against Roy, and now he was determined to handle the situation with the same dignity that had defined his entire career. His phone wouldn't stop ringing. First, it was his FBI colleagues, concerned about his safety and offering support. Then, the calls from journalists began, some local, others from national media outlets. The security camera footage that Jonathan had shared with authorities was now circulating, clearly and irrefutably showing Roy's aggression and unjustified use of force. Jonathan decided not to make any immediate statements to the press. He felt the case needed to unfold within the legal framework before becoming a media spectacle. But he knew that eventually he would have to face public scrutiny. Meanwhile, at the local police station, the atmosphere was tense. Rick Daniels, the police chief, had called an emergency meeting with his entire team. Entering the conference room, Rick dropped a thick case file onto the table, his face severe. What happened last night isn't just an individual problem. It's a stain on our entire police force, he said, looking each of his officers in the eyes. Roy Anderson didn't just violate our code of conduct, he broke the law. And I want everyone to understand something. I will not tolerate this kind of behavior. The room remained silent. Some officers looked uncomfortable, while others nodded solemnly. Rick continued, Anderson is suspended and will be prosecuted for his actions. Let this be a lesson to all of you. I don't care how long you've served in this department. Our duty is to protect and serve, regardless of a person's skin color, religion, or social class. In his office, Rick personally drafted the official incident report, including video evidence and witness statements. The document not only detailed Roy's actions, but also called for a deeper reflection on internal biases within the police force. Meanwhile, Jonathan received an unexpected visit that afternoon. 3 neighbors knocked on his door, 2 men and a woman, all with expressions of discomfort and a hint of shame. When Jonathan opened the door, they were met with a man who, despite everything that had happened, maintained a calm and receptive demeanor. "Hello, Jonathan," said one of the men, a neighbor named Tom, who lived a few houses down. "We wanted to talk to you if you have a few minutes." Jonathan nodded, inviting them to sit in the front yard, where the group gathered around the small table. The woman, who introduced herself as Jane, was the first to speak. "We wanted to apologize," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "What Roy did was horrible, and many of us saw how he treated you from the start, and we didn't do anything." Jonathan studied their faces, noticing the sincerity in their words. "I appreciate you coming," he finally responded, "but I'm not the one you need to apologize to. This incident is just a symptom of something much deeper. What Roy did wasn't just an attack on me. It was a reflection of a bigger problem in our society." His words seemed to strike a chord with the 3 neighbors, who exchanged uncomfortable glances. Tom nodded, lowering his gaze to the ground. "You're right. We can all do better," he said quietly. That same night, while Jonathan was checking his emails, he found an invitation from a major civil rights organization. They wanted him to share his experience in a webinar about racism and inequality. After thinking about it for a few minutes, he accepted. He knew that this case had drawn attention and that his voice could help create positive change. During the webinar, Jonathan spoke calmly but with conviction. "I don't want this case to be just another headline in the news. I want it to be a reminder that discrimination in any form doesn't just harm individuals, it weakens entire communities. Changing this requires more than just punishing the guilty. We need education, dialogue, and systemic reforms." His message resonated deeply with the audience, and the video of his speech went viral, reaching thousands of people who began discussing how to address racism and bias in their own communities. Roy Anderson's trial began just a month after the incident, but the impact of his actions had already spread far beyond the neighborhood. The evidence presented by Jonathan, particularly the security camera footage, was clear and irrefutable. The courtroom was filled with journalists and activists following every detail of the case. Roy, sitting in the defendant's seat, looked like a shadow of his former self. His shoulders were slumped and his eyes avoided the audience. During the proceedings, his statements were read aloud, and the recordings exposing his threatening behavior and racist remarks were played. Jonathan attended the trial, seated in the front row as the primary witness. His testimony was direct and composed, yet powerful. This wasn't just an act of intimidation, he stated to the jury. It was a reminder that even in places where we expect to find peace, prejudice and hatred can manifest in dangerous ways. The prosecutor argued that Roy's actions were not only an abuse of power, but also a direct threat to the safety of an innocent citizen. The defense tried to justify his behavior as a misunderstanding, but the video evidence was undeniable. The verdict came after only brief deliberations. Roy Anderson was found guilty of making threats with a firearm, abuse of power, and discriminatory conduct. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison, a decision that brought both relief and reflection to the community. When the judge read the sentence, Jonathan noticed something in Roy's face. Not just remorse, but a late realization that his actions had destroyed not only his career, but also his reputation and place in the community. After the trial, Jonathan became the focus of attention, not just in the neighborhood, but also among organizations fighting discrimination. However, what surprised him most was the response from his own neighbors. One afternoon, while working in his garden, an elderly woman named Margaret, who lived at the end of the street, timidly approached with a tray of cookies. "I know this doesn't make up for anything," she said, extending the tray with trembling hands. "But I wanted to tell you that I deeply regret not speaking up sooner. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was scared." Jonathan took the cookies with a calm smile. "Thank you. Margaret, we all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them and trying to do better." That gesture marked the beginning of a transformation in the neighborhood. Other neighbors began to approach, some with sincere apologies, others with small but meaningful gestures, like helping with yard work or inviting Jonathan to community gatherings. Slowly, the initial distrust faded, replaced by a sense of mutual respect. Jonathan also decided to organize a community event at the nearby park, a space that symbolized the heart of the neighborhood. With the help of a few neighbors, he set up an open discussion about inclusion, respect, and how to build a stronger, more united community. During the event, Jonathan spoke from the heart. "This isn't just my home, it's our home, and a home should be a place where everyone feels safe and welcome. We can't change the past, but we can build a better future together." Jonathan's words resonated deeply with the attendees, and the event became a catalyst for neighbors to reflect on their own biases and how they could contribute to positive change. Meanwhile, the impact of the incident continued to spread. Jonathan was invited to television programs and conferences to share his experience and talk about the need for systemic reforms in law enforcement. Whenever he had the opportunity, he emphasized that change didn't start in courtrooms or high-ranking offices. It started in local communities. "Real change," he said in one of his interviews, "happens when each of us chooses to act with empathy, respect, and courage, even in the most difficult situations." At the same time, Jonathan didn't forget to take care of himself. He started dedicating more time to activities that brought him peace, working in his garden, reading on quiet afternoons, and enjoying the serene atmosphere he had sought when moving here. One night, as he sat on his porch looking up at the stars, a group of children ran past on the sidewalk. One of them, a blonde-haired boy named Ethan, stopped and waved at him with a wide smile. "Hi, Mr. Carter!" he shouted before running off after his friends. Jonathan smiled. It was a small gesture, but to him it represented something much bigger. This was the kind of neighborhood he had always dreamed of, a place where the next generation could grow up free from the weight of prejudice and division. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Jonathan watched as his neighborhood changed slowly but surely. The white fences still stood, but the invisible barriers that had once divided people were beginning to crumble. Several months had passed since the incident with Roy Anderson. What had initially been a traumatic experience for Jonathan Carter had become a transformative chapter, not just for him, but for the entire community. The neighborhood streets felt more vibrant, filled with life and camaraderie. Conversations between neighbors were no longer just a quick exchange of pleasantries, but genuine dialogues that built real connections. Jonathan observed these changes with a mix of satisfaction and hope. He had witnessed something rare, a tangible shift in people's attitudes, not because someone had forced them to think differently, but because they had chosen to learn from their mistakes and grow. On one of his morning walks, he stopped in front of the house that had once belonged to Roy. Now it was empty, with a "for sale" sign hanging in the front yard. It was a silent reminder of the consequences of Roy's actions, but also of how far the community had come since that night. Jonathan continued walking, greeting several neighbors who were busy with their morning routines. Some were watering their gardens, others walking their dogs. They all greeted him warmly, something that had once seemed unimaginable. That afternoon, Jonathan received an email from a national civil rights organization. They wanted to honor him with an award for his bravery and leadership in promoting justice and equality. Though grateful, Jonathan wasn't seeking personal recognition. To him, the real reward was seeing how his neighborhood had evolved and how his experience had inspired others to confront their own biases. That night, Jonathan sat on his porch as he often did. The cool breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant sound of laughter from the nearby park. He looked up at the starry sky, feeling at peace for the first time since moving to the neighborhood. He thought about his life, about the battles he had fought as an FBI chief, and how this experience had been unlike anything he had faced before. In the professional battlefield, he had fought crime with facts, strategies, and evidence. Here, in his home, he had battled something deeper: prejudice, ignorance, and fear. But he hadn't fought alone. What had started as a personal conflict had turned into a collective effort. His neighborhood, once trapped in silence and indifference, was now a place where people stood up for one another, where children played without fear, and where adults learned the value of diversity and respect. Jonathan took a sip of tea and smiled. He knew there was still much to be done, that real change required constant effort. But for now, he was content with the progress. He understood that while the road to justice and equality was long, every step mattered. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of the wind and laughter fill the silence. This was the home he had always dreamed of, a place where not just him but everyone could find peace and belonging. And as the neighborhood slept beneath the starry sky, Jonathan Carter knew that while the journey toward a better world was difficult, he was willing to walk it, one step at a time. Want to hear more inspiring stories like this? Then leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. And let's talk in the comments. Where are you watching from? We'd love to know.